Scott DiMauro to testify. Welcome. Begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair Wiggum, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the State and Local Government Committee. My name is Scott DiMauro. I'm a high school social studies teacher from Worthington with 16 years of classroom teaching experience and currently serve as president of the Ohio Education Association. On behalf of OEA and our 120,000 members, I thank you for this opportunity to provide opponent testimony on House Bill 322 and House Bill 327. House Bill 322 prohibits school districts, charter schools, and state agencies from teaching a range of specific concepts that are labeled as divisive. Students will not receive graduation credit for any course that includes a prohibited concept listed in the bill. House Bill 322 also prohibits any classroom teacher, school administrator, or employee of a state agency without respect to course content from approving, making use of, or carrying out standards, curricula, lesson plans, textbooks, instructional materials, or instructional practices that serve to inculcate the prohibited concepts. The bill contains additional prohibitions against requiring a teacher to discuss current events or widely debated and currently controversial issues of public policy or social affairs, making part of a course an activity involving social or public policy advocacy, or accepting private funding to develop curriculum, purchase course materials, or provide training, professional development, or continuing education related to a course. House Bill 327 prohibits school districts, charter schools, private schools that enroll voucher students, state agencies, and state institutions of higher education from offering teaching, instruction, professional development, or training that promotes or insinuates a divisive concept. While House Bill 327 states it permits teaching about divisive concepts in a, quote, objective manner and without endorsement, unquote, these distinctions are open to interpretation and likely to become frighteningly incomprehensible when taking into account the extreme and draconian penalties the bill will bestow upon students, schools, and educators for perceived violations of divisive concept prohibitions. Some examples from House Bill 327. Students will not receive graduation credit for a course that includes any of the prohibited divisive concepts. If anyone submits a confirmed report that a school or state institution of higher education knowingly or recklessly violates a divisive concept prohibition in the bill, state funding shall be withheld in the following amounts: a 25% state funding deduction for the first offense, 50% for the second, and 100% state funding deduction for the third. The bill requires that the State Board of Education punish educators if it determines that a teacher, principal, or superintendent knowingly or recklessly violates the bill's divisive concept provisions. For a first offense, issue an official licensure admonishment, a license suspension for the second, and complete revocation of licensure for a period of time determined by the State Board, depending on severity and circumstances, for the third. The bill makes comparable changes to tenure policies for higher education faculty as well. These kinds of extreme penalties based on murky prohibitions will create an oppressive and fear-based environment that is not in the interest of students. OEA is clear in its advocacy to provide honesty in education for students and protect educators from harassment or fear for doing their jobs. OEA strongly opposes House Bill 322 and House Bill 327 because we believe that honesty and integrity are essential in the classroom because students deserve an honest and reflective education. Understanding the multiple perspectives and experiences that have shaped the country and the world to this point is the best tool we can give students to prepare them to interact with what is now an interconnected society and economy. Likewise, this means creating an educational environment that invites diverse experiences and multiple perspectives, as well as providing the resources and materials for all students to engage fully with the standards-based curriculum. In our locals, we are supporting efforts to help our members professionally in their efforts to create inclusive learning environments, celebrate diversity, and advocate for policies and programs that equitably meet all students' needs. Efforts to oppose this perspective have been part of a carefully coordinated national campaign and has resulted in divisive and dishonest attacks on educators and public schools in many of our communities. OEA is not aware of instances in local schools where topics considered critical race theory are being taught, and we discourage an approach to this issue that starts down the road of censorship. Students are not being taught to be ashamed of who they are or who their ancestors were. Quite the opposite. They're being empowered to be proud of who they are, regardless of where they come from. Teachers teach the state's learning standards and district curriculum as they have been prepared and entrusted to do without censorship or intimidation. At least that's the way it should be.
Mr. DiMauro, thank you for that
Thank you.
testimony. We're going to
Be happy to answer any
We're at the
questions.
five minutes, so thank you for the testimony. And do we have questions from our committee? We're going to start with Ranking Member Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming in today. You know, as a social studies teacher, I would think you would have a very interesting perspective on this because we've talked a lot about what the idea of divisive concepts may or may not be. And so I'm just wondering, in your experience, both as a practicing teacher and as a leader of teachers, what impact do you think these bills will have on your students' ability to think critically, to talk about things that might be, you know, universally popular, and what impact that could have on their educational opportunity here in Ohio?
Chair Wiggum, Representative Kelly, thank you for the question. And I guess I'll begin. I just finished my 30th year in education. I went into teaching because I believe in our country, and I thought the way to make the biggest difference was by teaching students to be good citizens. And the way to do that is by teaching problem solving and critical thinking and decision-making skills that will enable them to be empowered as citizens in our democracy. So doing that requires teaching the truth. It requires confronting students at an age-appropriate level based on the standards that have been adopted by the state and the curriculum that's been adopted by the local district, of presenting students with multiple perspectives to allow them to really tackle the content and do it in a way that's relevant. So for example, in my experience teaching history, you know, it's important to connect what's happened in the past with what's going on today. I think there are an awful lot of things, again, murky provisions in this bill that would cause me to really question as a teacher, how many of those connections can I make without offending somebody, without stepping over what the government has said is a line of limitation that would go too far. As I taught government, one of the things that would be explicitly prohibited is I routinely had my students complete service learning projects as a way to not just learn about how government works out of a textbook, but actually engage in an issue that they care about in order to understand how government at all levels works. And so I would be really concerned about continuing to employ that project. I remember one of the most powerful projects was a student who was deeply committed to the pro-life cause. And for her project, she volunteered with pro-life organizations. And I had other students that were really committed to environmental activism, and they committed their time to that. So the point is giving students some room. I also had an opportunity in my district in Worthington to teach a course. It was an elective course for seniors only. That was, it's been around for almost 50 years. It's called Political Thought and Radicalism, and allows students to learn about political ideology and their own perspective and their own identity, to engage with outside speakers from a range of perspectives, many very controversial. But through that whole experience, they learn how to engage in civil discourse. I don't even know that we could offer that course anymore because we wouldn't be allowed to offer credit to our students. So this would have an absolutely devastating impact on me as a professional, and I think a lot of others too.
Representative Sobecki.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony and coming in today. And I want to start by thanking each and every one of the educators out there right now as we're continuing to go through a pandemic on what they're doing each and every day to reach out to every one of our students. But I served on the Board of Education back in my home district for a number of years, and something that we always looked at was about how we could recruit and retain teachers here in the state of Ohio. And I'm going to put the pandemic to the side But we just heard in our education committee, primary secondary education committee the other day, about a shortage of substitute teachers again. And this is actually something that is nothing new to the pandemic, but something that's been going on for a long time in the state of Ohio, and also with recruiting and retaining teachers here. So with that, my question is, with bills like this coming through and the possibility of going through, do you feel that this is continually going to impact our ability in the state of Ohio to be able to recruit and retain not only teachers, but also recruit and retain substitute teachers within our state?
Thank you. Chair Wiggum, Representative Sabecki, I think it's an excellent question. There are a lot of things that are contributing to what we have serious concerns about in terms of the pipeline of talented people going into education. If you look at the number of people that have chosen education as a major, those in our teacher preparation programs around the state, we're at about half the level that we were 15 years ago. And there have been a number of things that have contributed to that. Certainly, people, having concerns about, how lucrative it is to be an educator, and the lack of resources and the high demands, and working with very diverse student population without having all the tools and resources necessary to meet those needs. Certainly the obsession with standardized testing has been part of that. And a lot of people feel that we've sucked the joy out of teaching and learning in a lot of ways with obsession on standardized tests. And then the COVID pressures have just mounted on top of that. If you introduce into that equation legislation like this that instills fear among educators, that fundamentally undermines the freedom of people to do the jobs that they were trained to do, then I believe that is going to make it so much harder to keep people in the profession. Why would people want to continue to labor when any day they're looking over their shoulder because someone might be coming at them with a lawsuit, or the State Department of Education might be sent a complaint because someone is offended by the way they are teaching their curriculum. So no, I do have very, very serious concerns about the implications of this legislation, and at a time when teachers need to be lifted up and appreciated and supported, this moves in the exact opposite direction.
Follow up?
Thank you for that. I really do appreciate that. I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit. Recently, this month, we just did the remembrance of 9/11 and how tragic that was. And some of the students that are in K-12 right now were not alive when that was happening. So these are topics, I'm sure, that we're having a conversation in classrooms to understand what happened on 9/11 and having a conversation. Do you feel that bills like this, if they were to pass, would impede the ability for teachers to be able to have conversations even about that horrific events that happened in our United States?
Chair Wiggum, Representative Sabecki, I think it would. And not just about 9/11, about so many other critical moments in our history, whether we're talking about different perspectives on the Vietnam War, or whether we're talking about the internment of Japanese during World War II, or whether we're talking about the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, or we're talking about the aftermath of Reconstruction. I mean, there are so many elements of our history that are uncomfortable, that require a deep dive from multiple perspectives to really think critically in order to fully understand our history. And so, you go down the line, I can only imagine how teachers are going to second guess whether or not they can go into any kind of depth. In fact, we all learn in our teacher preparation programs about Bloom's taxonomy, that the best learning is not just the basic understanding of the facts, but it's being able to analyze and synthesize information. We also know that learning happens through what we call cognitive dissonance. So when people hear something that's unfamiliar to them, we're all familiar with that, like in a physical fitness realm. Like we have to get uncomfortable in order to grow. I don't know what it's going to be like to be able to teach under those circumstances when every day you're worried about how something you do, something you say might be misconstrued.
Representative Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, sir, for being here today. I understand your testimony to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially that, CRT is not being taught in Ohio schools. Now, obviously, I think that's highly disputed by parents in a great many districts around Ohio. But even if we assume that was true for today's purpose, I guess my reading of this bill is asking the question of should it be? Should we be teaching CRT in the schools? And CRT clearly exists. I assume you're familiar with the National Education Association had a resolution passed over the summer that said that the National Education Association will share and publicize information already readily available on critical race theory, fight back against anti-CRT rhetoric, and further convey that teaching these topics, it's reasonable and appropriate for curriculum to include critical race theory. So my question is, do you agree or disagree with the National Education Association that CRT should or should not be taught in our schools?
Chair Wiggum, Representative Stewart, in that resolution that you just read, what I didn't hear was the NEA calling for teaching of critical race theory as part of the curriculum in our schools. And that is certainly not something that we have advocated for. State standards are set by our State Board of Education. Curriculum is set by local boards of education. We engage in those areas on things that make a difference to our members. We believe, and I will say, speaking for myself, speaking for our organization, that we have an obligation to ensure everything that we can do to make sure that all students have access to a great public education. And part of doing that is meeting students where they are, and that is making sure that every student sees themselves in their instruction. And so we have to be intentional about efforts on inclusion and on equity and on diversity. Unfortunately, in the debate, and by the way, the context for that particular resolution that you just read was a reaction to what had been months of a nationally generated campaign to use the term critical race theory to instill fear in communities around the country, and people that are using critical race theory defining it in all different ways. I mean, critical race theory, again, is an academic discipline that's about 40 years old, taught in law schools and graduate level courses about a way to understand the law. It is not part of our curriculum. What we will not stand down on, and what we do believe very strongly in, is that we need to advocate for every single one of our students. We have to recognize that there are certain injustices, and we have to work as educators to help overcome them. So I hope I answered your question, but the answer is no, we are not advocating for the teaching of critical race theory in our K-12 schools.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to drill down on this, though, because I feel like in these hearings, we talk past each other. We say critical race theory exists. Folks come in and say, well, but it's not being taught here. The text of the resolution from the NEA is the NEA will publicly convey its support for the accurate and honest teaching of social studies topics, including slavery, oppression, discrimination, as well as the continued impact this history has on our current society. The association will further convey that in teaching these topics, it is reasonable and appropriate for curriculum to be informed by academic frameworks for understanding and interpreting the impact of the past on our current society, including critical race theory. How is that read any other way than saying the NEA is advocating for critical race theory to be a part of curriculum?
Chair Wiggum, Representative Stewart, again, curriculum to be informed by it. In other words, we as the adults to have some context, to have some perspective, to have an honest understanding of history that recognizes that there are inequities in the system that are a result of laws that have been passed through the years that have created them. It is not saying, what you just read, does not say that we should be going in and telling a second grader about critical race theory, or even that we're telling a high school student that here is critical race theory. This is history. The history that I teach as a teacher, that my colleagues across the state teach, is the history that is in our state standards. The curriculum that we teach is the curriculum that's adopted by our local school districts. And now, should we be informed and have all the information as educators to be able to make sure that we are teaching in an inclusive way? Certainly. But that is not saying that we believe that critical race theory should be the curriculum in our schools.
Representative Galonsky.
Thank you to the chair, and thank you so much for being here and for your testimony. I would like to specifically turn the members' attention to section 257 of the bill, and this would be on page 10, which I think you would be very seriously concerned with because it's actually a prohibition on private funding. It says here that no state agency or school district shall accept private funding for curriculum development, purchase of selection of curriculum materials, teacher training, professional development, or continuing teacher education pertaining to courses on history, civics, United States government and politics, social studies, or similar subject areas. Do you have any concerns about that specific prohibition?
Chair Wiggum, Representative Galonsky, I do. I mean, I think there are lots of entities that are engaged in the work of providing support, curriculum support, instructional support, to help schools and educators have access to resources. The state just simply doesn't have the capacity to do it all itself. And in fact, I think in all elements of our curriculum, I think there's a strong culture of private-public partnerships that this would really have a negative impact on. And again, it's a question of how that language would be interpreted, but I think there could be some unintended consequences there.
Okay. Any other questions by the committee? Representative Callender.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming in and for taking on the career choice you've made. We need good, deep thinkers, forward thinkers, and folks that appreciate American history in the field. So thank you to all. I think we've got some students in education here at political science, and I appreciate that. As in my history, I've taught political science and a lot of on the university level and a lot of critical thinking courses, and I think the concepts you bring forward are important to those who are studying American history, and it's important that we understand all angles and all sides, and to be well-informed citizens, we need to know the good and the bad. Unfortunately, today, we're in such a polarized nation that it is very easy to slip from learning history to advocating one side or the other, or for a student, especially a younger student, to take something that is taught maybe further than was intended and lead to, even though that's not the intent at all, but that would lead to bullying based on certain characteristics of that person. So one of my thoughts is, and I keep going back to this, what would you think of some kind of trigger where we keep a prohibition on some of these teachings, specifically some of the divisive concepts, until students are further along the learning and are more in a place academically or emotionally that it's appropriate to help them in their development? Certainly on the college level, we want to encourage that kind of discussion. But we've had some complaints, and I think all of us in this room, most of us in this room, have gotten complaints from parents that feel like an individual teacher has maybe taken it too far at too young of an age and created a bullying or a scared atmosphere for those students. How do you see, do you see any balance there on a way we can address that issue where we, protect the sanctity of the classroom and the academic freedom like we do on the college level, but we don't put too much on these kids that they aren't necessarily in a place to have yet, where we don't have enough of the basics, or we don't have the maturity, or quite frankly, sometimes we've had some educators that have left students feeling afraid to go to the classroom because of what's being taught. And I think that's the point of these bills, is to try to protect these students from that.
Chair Wiggum, Representative Callender, I think you raised an excellent question, and I think we are in complete agreement that we want students to be in a place where they are safe. And again, for a little bit of context, many of our students of color over the years have felt like they weren't in a safe space, which is why we have been making the effort to make sure that we're deliberate about inclusivity and equity in our teaching. So it is just as important for our white students as it is for our black students, for our male students as it is for our female students, that they know that they are not going to be judged for who they are, and that they are going to be supported in their learning, and they're going to be challenged in their learning in an age-appropriate way that is connected to the curriculum. I would contend that it doesn't take legislation to get to that. In fact, I would say we already have mechanisms in place. We have, on a fundamental level, it's a responsibility of every teacher, it's a responsibility of every principal to engage openly and have good, open, honest communication with parents, so that we're listening to feedback, we're hearing feedback, we understand what the sensitivities are in a given community, and we're responsive to that. And so the first thing is that if something happens in a classroom and there's a concern, I hope that the parent would have a conversation with the teacher, and if that doesn't resolve the concern, then have a conversation with the principal. Taking it to another level, we also in this state of Ohio have a code of professional conduct. And we have a code of professional conduct that lays out very clearly what those lines are that can't be crossed. What the code of professional conduct doesn't do, and what I think this legislation would do, unfortunately, is it would say, if we're introducing, belief systems, into things, and we're essentially inviting controversy and conflict, and I don't think that's necessary. I think we should use the tools that are already available to try to make sure that all students are safe and supported in their learning. So I just don't think that this is the direction that will get us to where I think you and I agree we want to be.
And follow up?
Thank you, and I certainly don't disagree with what you're saying. Unfortunately, the reason these pieces of legislation were brought forward is because there have been a number of citizens who feel that it has gone too far, and it's created a new class of kids that are being bullied or made fun of, or that are ashamed or go home upset. And as you said, no child, regardless of race or gender or orientation, no child should feel, because of their curriculum, because of what's being taught, less than any other child. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is parents who are having their children come home like that. They're going to the teacher, then they're going to the principal, they're going to the school board, and finally they've come to us. And I think, ergo the problem. I certainly don't disagree that we have historically not done a good job of making all students feel included and feel equal. And we need to address that as a society, as a state, as a field in education. But you don't do that by simply switching which kids feel inferior when they go home. You deal with that by building everybody up. And critical race theory, where it has been attempted to be brought in our schools, and it has in some of our local districts, has in effect created kids that feel bullied and worried about going to school and upset. So I would ask you, because I think we agree on the end result, right? We want every child to feel whole, to feel valued, to feel empowered, to become good citizens, to become good Americans. But if something being taught in their school makes them feel inferior, that's not okay, regardless of what your political leanings are, right?
Representative Callender, can we get to the question, just so?
So, would you commit to helping find a way to reach a medium here?
Chair Wiggum, Representative Callender, I'd be happy to continue that conversation with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
One question I have, we just talked about inclusivity. You spoke about that briefly, and then you spoke about it along racial lines. And so, could you give an example? Is there an example of what you were talking about then in a schoolroom that may happen that deals with trying to talk about inclusivity within the classroom dealing with race? Something that you think that this bill will not allow, or any other example?
Well, Chair Wiggum, first off, I don't think that this bill will do anything to move us towards being more inclusive in terms of how we work with students. In thinking about some of the equity work and the inclusion and diversity efforts that have been, I think, very productive in a lot of schools, it is making sure that the curriculum really is balanced. That, for example, one example that I hear a lot, and I think as a teacher, I've needed to check myself based on my understanding, and the more I learn, I think the better I've become on this. To not essentially marginalize a certain group of students by saying this is your month. February is Black History Month, and so the rest of the curriculum is everybody else's history, but this is Black history. It should be fundamentally integrated throughout the curriculum, and I think what's taught well, we do that, but sometimes we have to be really intentional to make sure that in the literature that we select, in the content that we focus on and spend time on in our schools, in the people we lift up and recognize their leadership and their contributions to our history, that we are looking at that from multiple perspectives. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I really agree with the point that you've made there, with that history is history, and black, white, it's our history. And so there are certainly things in our history that are tough to learn, and we need to know and learn from that and move forward. But you also mentioned being balanced. As a teacher, trying to find that balance. What does that mean in finding balance then in the world of inclusivity? What would you give an example of trying to make something balanced in the conversation about history?
Chair Wiggum, as an instructional practice, one way to be balanced is to be very conscious of as a teacher, I want to be very conscious of my biases. Do I have a tendency to pay more attention to the boys in my class than the girls in my class? And so getting balance is by being aware of some of those unintended biases or implicit biases that they have, and having strategies intentionally to overcome them. I think when you're talking about balance in content, it depends on what the topic is. There are some things that you can't both sides, talking about the evils of slavery or the evils of the Holocaust isn't the kind of thing that a good teacher is going to say, well, that there were good people on both sides, that the people that were defenders of slavery were doing the right thing, or there's an argument that they were doing the right thing. So balance doesn't necessarily mean that all perspectives have equal side. Balance doesn't say that stopping the scourge of Nazism during World War II wasn't the right thing for our country to do. But balance in speaking about, let's say, teaching about the Holocaust, is acknowledging that while we're fighting a war in Europe to try to stop Hitler, we also had policies that prevented Jewish refugees from coming into the United States. That's adding balance. That's making sure that the whole history, is taught. There's a quote by James Baldwin that I think is really apt here. American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than we fully appreciate. We need to understand you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if we don't, and if our students don't, then how can we expect them to make the country better?
Representative Fowler Arthur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. DiMauro, for being here and for raising some of these concerns. Obviously, it's difficult when testifying on two bills to make the distinction between what one may or may not, but I do want to point out as a joint sponsor on 327 that advocating is permitted in 327, specifically that we're saying that a district can't require a student to advocate for or against, but that doesn't mean that the student cannot, or that the classroom teacher cannot encourage them to. I'm hearing this discussion about the balance, okay? And when you're talking about whole, complete history being the goal, I think that's the goal of these bills. So do you feel that the word balance would be a better way of stating objective and, the bills, I'm gonna speak specifically to 327. 327 specifically focuses on trying to be objective, trying to make sure that all perspectives are heard, that we aren't only promoting one ideology. Are you saying that if we include the word balance, that would help convey an appropriate understanding of what's intended, as opposed to using the word objective or trying to get all sides to be represented?
Chair Wiggum, Representative Fowler Arthur. I mean, it might help in clarifying, I guess, the intent, but fundamental to both House Bill 322 and House Bill 327 is that certain things are just forbidden. That there are certain concepts that just can't be talked about in school. And, I think that kind of approach, which again, if I were teaching about this, removing ourselves from this place, I think about some of the parallels in other times of history, where we've seen these kinds of efforts, and what are the consequences of that. I just think the whole approach to passing legislation to ban the teaching of divisive concepts is just misguided. And so even if that kind of adjustment were made to the language, we would still be strongly opposed to both bills.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that. I have to give another clarification because 327 specifically uses the word promote as opposed to teach. We believe it's very important for students to learn all sides of our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to make sure that we learn from the past. So I just wanted to focus on one other question regarding the educator piece that you brought up, and I'm sure you're aware that the 327 also includes a portion of due process for teachers, and to make sure that teachers are not facing penalties or discrimination on their failure to agree with a divisive concept. And I've had several teachers approach me and say that this is a big problem in our area, or that they have felt discriminated against in their class setting. Can you speak to that a little bit as well, whether or not due process for the teachers currently exists for if they feel discriminated against in the classroom, in the hiring process, excuse me?
Chair Wiggum, Representative Fowler Arthur, I don't know. I don't have information to be able to answer the last part of your question in terms of people feeling discriminated against. Certainly, as a union, our responsibility is to protect the legal rights of our members, and so anytime someone has a legal cause of action, we're there to defend them, or we're there to protect them. I appreciate the effort of trying to create due process protections in this, but I can only imagine, because of the inherent ambiguity of some of the language in the bill, even the word promote as opposed to discuss, that is still open to all kinds of interpretation, and I think we will see a whole lot of litigation that isn't going to do anybody any good.
Okay. Representative Golonsky.
Thank you to the chair, and thank you so much for your last comment in particular, because just as Representative Fowler-Author knows, I was the one who raised the question of whether or not House Bill 327 actually defines promotes. So would it surprise you to know that it doesn't at all define promotes?
I agree.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for your testimony today. Okay, and
Thank
seeing
you.
no further questions, appreciate it.
Appreciate it.